Mississippi, the kind of heat that made truth sweat, the kind that made the air taste like rust and rain that never fell. In a land where the law had a color and justice had a price, a black journalist named Calvin Reed stepped off a northbound train and into the heart of a story no one wanted told. He wasn't famous, not yet. Just another man with ink-stained fingers, a battered Rolleiflex camera, and a belief that the dead deserved to be seen. The newspaper that sent him south expected a column. What they got was a confession, written in blood and silence. The town of Greenwood slept behind its smiles, white storefronts shining like teeth, black neighborhoods humming with the nervous music of survival. Calvin rented a small room above a closed tailor shop, where the ceiling fan whispered names he didn't yet know. His first lead came folded in a church bulletin. A boy gone missing after choir practice, a sheriff who said, "Don't go poking where it's dark." But darkness was exactly where Calvin lived best. Every click of his camera felt like trespassing on someone's secret. Every interview was a step closer to the thing nobody dared to name. The Klan no longer rode at noon or bragged in daylight. Their power had learned patience. Their faces didn't need hoods anymore. They wore badges, owned stores, led prayers. Calvin had covered wars abroad, but this was a war fought in whispers, a war where truth was both weapon and target. The deeper he looked, the more he realized he wasn't just chasing a story, he was walking through a graveyard of untold ones. Somewhere between the river and the railroad tracks, between what people said and what they meant, Calvin Reed began to understand. The South didn't hide its sins, it buried them standing up. The first story found him before he went looking. A 17-year-old boy named Samuel Carter, last seen walking home from choir practice, his hymnal still open to "Leaning on the Everlasting Arms." His mother said he never missed curfew, never raised his voice, never gave the world a reason to hate him. But in Mississippi, no reason was ever required. Calvin walked the road Samuel had taken, a narrow stretch between the cotton fields and the river. The dirt was still soft from last night's rain, and his shoes left the same kind of prints the killers might have. A tire rut cut through the mud like a scar that refused to heal. He crouched low, studying, the ground as if it might whisper. In the distance, cicadas hummed like broken telegraphs, and the scent of wet earth carried something metallic. Faint, but enough to make him write it down. Smell of blood, old but close. The sheriff's office stood at the corner of Market and Main, a building the color of sunburned bone. Inside, a fan turned slow as a dying clock, slicing the air into lazy pieces. Sheriff Earl Tillman smiled when Calvin walked in, the kind of smile that measured a man, before it answered him. "Paper from up north," he said. "Ain't much to print down here, 'cept crops and funerals." Calvin opened his notebook, steady, polite. "Then let's start with the funerals." The smile thinned. The sheriff leaned back, boots on the desk, fingers drumming. "Boy wandered off. Happens." Calvin let the word boy hang there. 17, but called a child when it suited them, a man when blame was needed. "He didn't wander," Calvin said quietly. "He was taken." For a moment, the room forgot to breathe. The sheriff's hand froze mid-drum, and something colder than authority flickered in his eyes. By dusk, Calvin stood outside the small wooden church where Samuel's mother lit candles even after the power had come back. Her voice trembled only once when she said, "They told me to stop asking questions, said it was better to let it rest." Calvin's pencil scratched across the page, carving her words into permanence. "Mom," he said softly, "if they wanted it to rest, they shouldn't have buried it alive." She stared at him, searching his face for the kind of strength that didn't vanish under threat. "You gonna print it true?" she asked. "Every word," he promised. When he stepped back into the night, the air felt heavier, like the sky itself knew what it was hiding. Somewhere beyond the fields, an engine idled once, then stopped. He looked down that road, camera ready, pulse steady, and whispered to himself, "All right then, let's see who's watching." The next morning the town looked ordinary, but only to those who didn't know where to look. To Calvin, Greenwood was a stage built on silence. Every glance carried a question, every smile hid a warning. When he passed the diner, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Spoons paused above coffee cups. He could feel eyes in the reflection of the window, studying his every step. The local paper refused to print his name, yet somehow everyone already knew it. The story of a northern Negro asking about a missing boy had moved faster than the mail. He walked to the post office and found an envelope slipped into his box without a stamp. If you want to know what happened to Carter, follow the river past mile 14. No signature, just smudged ink and fingerprints that smelled faintly of oil. He folded it once, slid it into his coat, and knew this wasn't curiosity anymore, it was invitation. The river lay 2 miles out, breathing slow under the heat. Trees leaned over it like guilty witnesses, their roots tangled in mud too soft to hold secrets. Calvin found the path marked by crushed weeds and cigarette ash, the scent of kerosene still clinging to the earth. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became, as if the air itself didn't want to carry sound. Then he saw it, the flash of something pale between the reeds. For a moment he thought it was cloth, but when he pulled it free, he realized it was skin. Not fresh, but recent. Enough to make the world tilt sideways. He stepped back, breath catching, and raised the camera. The shutter snapped once, the sound small but final. Then again. The water shifted, revealing a shoe, a hand, a boy who would never sing another hymn. Calvin lowered the camera slowly, whispering the name like a prayer. Samuel. By the time the sheriff's car rolled up, Calvin had already hidden the negatives inside a hollow tree trunk. The deputies moved with practiced boredom, their faces carved from the same dull stone as the courthouse. One of them spat near Calvin's shoe. "You should have left that boy where you found him," he said. The sheriff just stared at the body, then at Calvin. "You think you done something brave?" he asked, voice low. "All you done is stir ghosts." Calvin didn't answer. He looked past the men, past their trucks, to the river swallowing sunlight like guilt. He knew the photographs would be denied, dismissed, or destroyed if he stayed. But he also knew the truth was no longer his to hide. As the sheriff turned away, Calvin caught his reflection in the water, calm, cold, and unbothered. The look of a man who'd buried more than one lie under that current. Calvin spent the night in his small rented room above the tailor shop, the air thick with humidity and adrenaline. The photographs hung from a string over the sink, still wet with chemicals, the boy's face ghost-like under the red lamplight. Each frame felt heavier than the one before, each detail a blade pointed at the lie called peace. He wrapped the negatives in wax paper, sealed them inside an envelope, and addressed it to his editor in Chicago. Priority. Confidential. Eyes only. When the post office opened at dawn, he stood first in line, collar damp with sweat, his hands steady despite the tremor crawling beneath his ribs. The clerk didn't look at him when he asked for postage, didn't ask what was inside. Everyone in that town had already learned that not knowing was safer than being right. As the parcel disappeared into the slot, Calvin whispered to himself, "Now let's see if truth can outrun bullets." By noon, the rumors began to move faster than the mail train. Men who had ignored him yesterday now watched from porches, their silence sharpened to suspicion. The tailor downstairs closed early, muttering about family out in Yazoo City. When Calvin returned to his room, he found his door cracked open, his suitcase turned out like a confession, The photographs were gone, but the negatives remained where he'd hidden them in the false bottom of the desk. Whoever had come didn't know what to look for. He exhaled slow, then smiled, the kind of grim smile a man wears when he knows he's still one step ahead. He waited until sunset, then packed what little he had left, a change of clothes, his camera, his notebook, and the will to keep breathing. Outside, the streets looked empty, but the stillness felt rehearsed, like everyone was holding their breath for something inevitable. That night, Calvin walked down to the telegraph office, intending to warn his editor that he might be compromised. The operator, a nervous boy who avoided his gaze, shook his head before Calvin even spoke. "Wires are down," he said. "Storm." But there was no storm. The air was dry, the stars cruelly clear. Calvin stepped outside and saw it then. A car parked across the street, engine idling, lights off. Inside, 3 men sat in silence. One struck a match, the flame painting his face in orange for a heartbeat. The same deputy who had spat near the riverbank. Calvin didn't run. Instead, he raised his camera and took a picture, the flash bursting like lightning in the dark. The car lunged forward, tires screaming, but by the time it reached the corner, Calvin was gone, swallowed by the alleyways that knew his fear better than anyone. That night he slept with his camera clutched to his chest, dreaming not of death, but of exposure. Morning came slow, dragging the night behind it like a body. Calvin didn't waste time on fear. He turned it into momentum. At sunrise, he slipped into the courthouse, walking like a man with purpose, coat pressed, shoes shined, blending in where he didn't belong. The clerk at the records desk barely looked up, just pointed toward a cabinet labeled County Patrols. Calvin opened drawers that smelled of mildew and smoke. Fingers, tracing ledgers filled with names that pretended to mean nothing, volunteer groups, social clubs, vigilance committees, all legal, all lies. But tucked between them, a list marked Citizens Defense League. Same initials as the note he'd received, CDL. He copied the names quickly, his pencil scratching like a blade. The sheriff's name wasn't there, but 4 of his deputies were, along with the owner of the feed store, the local judge, and the man who ran the power plant that kept the in town in light. Calvin paused on that name, Eugene Crawley, a man whose electricity lit every home except those he wanted left in the dark. That afternoon, Calvin found Crawley where rumor said he'd be, at the lodge on Highway 7, drinking bourbon behind drawn curtains. Crawley was the kind of white man who smiled like it cost him money. "You the reporter," he said, swirling the glass. "Always a reporter down here, till they ain't." Calvin leaned forward, his voice even. "You supply power to every building in this town. That include the ones they use for meetings?" Crawley's smile flickered, just enough to show the truth underneath. "I sell to everyone," he said. "What they do with it ain't my concern." But it was. Calvin had seen enough eyes avert themselves to recognize guilt that paid its bills on time. He stood to leave. Crawley's voice followed him, low and oily. "You writing a story, Mr. Reed? Careful what you publish. Light attracts things that bite." Calvin didn't turn back. "So does blood," he said, and walked out into the glare of a sun that burned too honestly for men like Crawley. That night, Calvin wrote the first draft of the article that could cost him his life. The Men Who Make the Darkness Run. He listed the names, dates, locations, careful, measured, factual. But between the lines, he let the fury breathe. He described the way the sheriff's patrols vanished hours before, accidents, how the electric bills of abandoned barns were paid by county accounts, how witnesses were found dead before they ever swore an oath. As the typewriter keys clattered, he heard footsteps below. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to be the tailor returning early. He blew out the lamp, grabbed his negatives, and stepped into the hallway. The footsteps paused. Then a voice rose from the darkness. "You think truth keeps you safe, Reed?" He didn't answer. He slipped out the back door into the alley, into the arms of a night that had stopped pretending it didn't care who lived or died. Calvin ran until the streetlights thinned to nothing but memory. The alleys twisted around him, narrow as throats, slick with humidity and the smell of coal dust. When he finally stopped, he was behind the old Victory Theatre, its marquee long gone, its windows blind with soot. From inside came a faint hum, the steady rhythm of an enlarger lamp. He pushed the door open and found a man hunched over a tray of developer fluid, cigarette smoke curling above his head like fog over a swamp. The man didn't startle. He just said without turning, "You must be the one the sheriff wants dead." His name was Leon Patterson, a local photographer who had once taken school portraits and wedding pictures until certain faces stopped hiring him. Now he printed photographs the town pretended didn't exist, bruised backs, burned crosses, funerals without preachers. Calvin stared at the wall behind him. It was covered in images no one was supposed to see. Leon spoke softly, eyes fixed on the photograph floating in the tray. "They call me crazy for keeping proof. But paper don't lie. Men do." Calvin pulled the negatives from his coat and slid them across the counter. "Then let's make them visible." Leon glanced at the strips, whistled low. "Lord, you got the river itself to confess." For hours they worked under the red light, the air thick with chemicals and quiet determination. Faces appeared like ghosts refusing to stay buried. Deputies laughing, hoods drying on clotheslines, the sheriff shaking hands with Crawley outside the courthouse. Each image was a sermon of guilt. When the last print dried, Leon pinned it to the wall beside the others. "You ever wonder," he said, lighting another cigarette, "why truth don't scare them?" Calvin shook his head. Leon blew smoke toward the ceiling. "'Cause they think no one'll ever believe it. That's where you come in." They sealed the photographs in envelopes and hid them in 3 separate locations, one under the stage floorboards, one inside a church hymnal, and one inside Leon's prosthetic camera case, hollowed from the back. "Redundancy," Leon said, "is the poor man's insurance." Outside, thunder began to crawl across the sky, low and threatening. "Storm's coming," Calvin muttered. Leon nodded. "Been coming a long time." As Calvin left, the rain broke open, heavy and relentless, washing the streets clean of pretense. But through the downpour, headlights bloomed, 2 cars parked at the end of the block, engines rumbling low. He didn't wait to see the faces. He ran, the envelope pressed to his chest, his breath tearing at the edges of silence. Somewhere behind him, a window shattered and Leon's voice echoed once before the thunder swallowed it whole. Calvin didn't look back. He knew what courage sounded like when it died doing its job. Calvin drove through the storm with both hands, gripping the wheel and the envelope wedged inside his jacket. The rain falling so hard, it felt like God himself was trying to erase the map. The road out of Greenwood stretched ahead, long and lonely, a dark ribbon slicing through the delta's flat silence. Every mile marker felt like a heartbeat, steady, counting down to something unseen. He thought of Leon, of the photographs pinned to that wall of ghosts, and forced himself not to imagine the sound of gunfire behind him. Lightning flashed, turning the wet asphalt silver. In that instant, Calvin saw it. A car sitting sideways across the bridge ahead, lights off, doors open. A blockade made of quiet and certainty. He slowed, pulse hammering, and reached for the camera in the passenger seat. A reflex, not for safety, but for proof. He stopped the car 20 yards short. The rain hissed against the hood, thunder rolling like drums of war. 2 men stepped into view, their coats clinging to their shoulders, hats tilted low. "Evening, Mr. Reed," one of them called. The voice was familiar, the deputy with the cigarette smile. You in a hurry to get somewhere?" Calvin said nothing, his breath fogging the glass. The other man approached the driver's side, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "We hear you've been taking pictures that don't belong to you." Calvin forced a thin smile. "Pictures belong to whoever has the courage to keep them." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a flash split the dark, not lightning this time, but the burst of his camera, blinding the men long enough for him to slam the car into reverse, tires screaming, mud flying like blood. The sound of gunfire followed, sharp and final, bullets punching through metal, glass exploding into rain. He didn't stop until the road curved into the trees and the engine began to cough from the strain. The windshield was gone, the wind slicing through his coat, rain burning his eyes. He pulled off, near a broken sign that read Tallahatchie County Line, and let the car die where it stood. The envelope was still dry against his chest, a small miracle in a night made of ruin. He stepped out, boots sinking into the soaked dirt, and stared back down the empty road. The cars weren't following anymore, not yet. He walked into the trees, clutching his camera like a weapon, every flash of lightning showing him the path forward. Somewhere ahead, the railroad tracks would lead north, to Memphis, to a train, to daylight. But for now he was a man alone in the wet wilderness, hunted by those who believed the truth was theirs to kill. He looked up at the sky, rain pouring into his open mouth, and whispered, "You'll have to try harder than that." By dawn, Calvin stumbled into Clarksdale, a place that looked like salvation if you didn't stare too long. The air carried the sweet, heavy scent of magnolias and the faint hum of blues spilling from a juke joint still awake from more. The night before, he kept his head down, coat buttoned tight, camera strap cutting into his shoulder. The train depot sat at the edge of town, old and rusting but still alive enough to carry hope. He needed to reach the northbound line. Just one parcel, one envelope, and the world would know what Greenwood tried to bury. The telegraph operator was a young black woman with sharp eyes and a voice soft as dust. Her name tag read E. Henson. She glanced at his soaked clothes, then at the envelope. "You from Greenwood?" she asked quietly. Calvin hesitated, then nodded. Her face tightened, but she said nothing. She just pointed to the corner where the mailbags waited. "Put it there. I'll see it makes the train." He thanked her, but her silence lingered like thunder that hadn't decided when to strike. He bought a coffee from the diner across the street and sat by the window, watching the depot through the steam of his cup. A freight train whistled once. Long, low, lonely. Relief almost reached him when he saw her walk toward the platform, envelope in hand. But then he noticed something else. 2 uniformed officers standing by the telegraph pole, talking to a man in a grey suit he recognized too well. Deputy Hollis, Crawley's errand boy. The girl froze mid-step, eyes darting toward Calvin. For a second the whole world narrowed to that look. Fear, warning, apology. Then Hollis turned, grinning like a man who'd already won. Calvin dropped his cup and ran. The bell above the diner door screamed as he burst into the street, his boots slapping puddles, his heartbeat matching the rhythm of the train pulling away without him. He could hear them shouting behind him. Orders, curses, his name. He cut through an alley that stank of old grease and rot, the kind of place daylight forgot. A cat hissed and vanished into the trash. At the far end, the alley opened onto the back of a laundromat. Its windows steamed over. Calvin ducked. Inside, the air hot and thick with soap and fear. The old man at the counter looked up, startled, then recognized him from the papers pinned behind the register. "You, that journalist," he said softly. "The one stirring up hornets." Calvin caught his breath, eyes scanning for exits. "You know a way to the tracks?" The man hesitated, then nodded toward the rear door. "Go, and God keep you." Calvin started toward it, but paused, turning back. "If they come," he said, "you didn't see me. The man's voice cracked like a whispered prayer. "Ain't seen nothing since 1938. Calvin pushed through the door and vanished into the morning fog. The envelope gone, but the film still safe. Behind him, the sirens began to rise, and the town that smiled too much showed its teeth. The fog followed him into the fields like a living thing. Calvin ran until the noise of Clarksdale dissolved into crickets and the low hum of the wind through cypress trees. His shoes were heavy with mud, his breath ragged, his body running on instinct alone. When the land finally flattened into open farmland, he saw it, a farmhouse at the edge of a pecan grove, its roof sagging, its windows blank. The porch leaned like an old man refusing to fall. He pushed the door open and stepped into a silence so complete it felt sacred. The air smelled of dust and old wood smoke. Someone had once loved this place. He could feel it in the wallpaper peeling in floral shapes, in the rusted tin cup left on the sill. He moved carefully through the rooms until he found the parlor, where a single photograph hung crooked on the wall. A black family, proud and still, standing beside a cotton field that stretched like a promise. He wiped the dust from the glass and whispered, "You built this, and they took it." He unrolled his coat, spreading out the remaining negatives on the wooden floor. The red light of dawn crept through a broken window, touching each image like revelation. Faces stared back at him. Deputies in plain clothes, Crawley shaking hands with the sheriff, a man in robes climbing into a truck with county tags. Calvin realized then it wasn't just Greenwood. It wasn't even Mississippi. It was a network. Men trading hate like currency, violence coordinated like commerce. The killings weren't chaos, they were order. He wrote the words carefully in his notebook. It's not the Klan. It's the system wearing a mask. His hand trembled, but not from fear. He knew now what the story truly was. The boy's death was only the spark. The fire was everywhere, waiting for someone with a match and the will to strike it. By nightfall, the house no longer felt empty. He heard boots crunching outside, slow and deliberate, the sound of men who didn't need to hurry. He reached for his camera, but this time it wasn't for evidence. It was for light. The flash exploded once, illuminating the window just long enough to catch their silhouettes. 3 men, rifles in hand, faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. He ducked as a bullet tore through the wall, splintering the frame where the family photograph hung. The next shot shattered the lamp. The house went dark. Calvin crawled toward the back door. The negatives clutched tight. Outside, the field waited, open, flat, unforgiving. He broke into a run, heart pounding like thunder against bone. Behind him, the farmhouse caught fire, flames climbing the walls like truth demanding to be seen. The wind carried the smoke toward the horizon, and Calvin didn't look back. He knew the photograph would burn, but the story had already learned to live without paper. Calvin reached the small church just before dawn, the kind of place that looked humble even to God. Its paint was peeling, the bell cracked, the door held shut by a single piece of rope tied into a patient knot. He knocked once, then twice, until a voice called from inside, low and cautious. "Ain't no service today." "I'm not here to pray," Calvin answered. The door creaked open, and an old preacher stepped out, tall, thin, wrapped in a coat older than the church itself. "Name's Reverend Josiah Turner," he said. "I know who you are. Been hearing about you since Greenwood." Calvin didn't deny it. He just said, "I need a place to rest and a place to think." The Reverend nodded, opening the door wider. "Rest you can have. Thinking's dangerous, though. That's how they find you." Calvin stepped inside, boots dripping rainwater onto the wooden floor, the faint smell of kerosene and hymns filling the air. He sat on the first pew, the negatives spread before him like communion. Reverend Turner watched from the pulpit, silent, measuring the man before him. "You still believe printing it will save us?" he finally asked. Calvin's voice was tired but sure. "Not save us, but maybe shame them." The preacher chuckled, dry as winter leaves. "Son, you can't shame a man who sold his soul and calls it profit." Calvin looked up, eyes hard. "Then I'll make him famous instead." Turner's face softened. "You sound like a younger me." He walked closer, kneeling beside the photographs. "I used to think light could change a man's heart. Then I learned light just shows him what he already is." Calvin said nothing. The rain drummed against the roof, a steady rhythm of confession. Finally, the preacher added quietly, "If you mean to publish, do it from Memphis. There's a man there," runs the defender's voice. "Name's L.C. Darnell. He's got friends who don't scare easy." That night they sat by the oil lamp, two men of different callings bound by the same gospel of truth. The preacher told him how men in hoods had once dragged him from this very church and left him bleeding by the river. "They thought they ended me," he said, "but they just changed the sermon." He reached into his coat and handed Calvin a small revolver wrapped in cloth. "I kept it for years, swore I'd never use it again. But words can't always outrun bullets." Calvin took it, feeling its weight like guilt. "Thank you, Reverend." Turner nodded. "Don't thank me. Just live long enough to tell it right." Before dawn, Calvin slipped out through the back, following the preacher's directions toward the rail yard. The church bell groaned once, a sound that wasn't quite goodbye. Behind him the old man stood in the doorway, the lamp burning beside him like faith refusing to die, fragile, flickering but still lit. The rail yard smelled of oil and rain-soaked steel, the kind of place where ghosts and men worked the same shift. Calvin crouched behind a freight car, coat-soaked, breath fogging the pre-dawn air. The train to Memphis groaned like an old giant waking from a troubled dream. Each car shuddered as workers loaded crates marked farm supplies, though he knew some of those boxes carried darker cargo. He waited until the whistle screamed, then climbed into the last car, pressing himself against the cold metal floor. The engine pulled forward, slow at first, then faster, the rhythm of the tracks like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. He clutched the camera and the negatives close, praying the preacher's directions would carry him farther than luck ever could. Outside, the delta blurred into shadow, the fields fading into mist. For the first time in days, he let himself believe he might live to see his story printed in ink. The chua relief lasted 7 minutes. At the 8th, headlights bloomed behind the train, 2 cars tearing down the dirt road that paralleled the tracks. The first bullet hit the side of the freight car, a metallic scream that jolted him upright. The second punched clean through, splintering a crate near his head. He ducked, heart hammering, eyes searching for escape. The world outside was a blur of trees and rain. The shooters kept pace, their rifles flashing like lightning with no thunder. Calvin crawled toward the coupling, gripping the cold iron lever. If he could detach the car, he might lose them in the dark. He pulled hard, once, twice, until the latch gave way with a violent clang. The rear car lurched, then slowed, dragging sparks across the rails as the rest of the train pulled ahead. The gunfire grew distant, fading into the roar of rain and steel. Calvin exhaled, trembling, alive for now. When the train finally stopped near Tupelo, he slipped off and landed in wet grass, knees buckling from exhaustion. The station lights glowed faint through the fog, yellow and kind like they didn't yet know who he was. He limped toward them, his shoes squelching with each step, the negatives still dry against his chest. Inside the depot, a porter cleaning the floors looked up, eyes narrowing. "You Calvin Reed?" The words froze him mid-step. The porter nodded toward the telegraph counter. "Call for you." Calvin hesitated, then lifted the receiver. "The Line hissed, then carried a familiar voice. Calm, southern, certain. "Mr. Reed," said Sheriff Tillman, "I do hope you're enjoying your trip. Be a shame if your editor in Chicago got your story before you did." The line clicked dead. Calvin lowered the receiver slowly, the cold spreading through him like a sickness. They already knew where he was going. The chase wasn't over. It was only changing trains. Memphis met him with the smell of diesel, sweat, and smoke. A city alive, yet uneasy, as if holding its breath between sin and salvation. The station pulsed with voices and motion, but Calvin moved through it unseen, just another tired traveler clutching a satchel that meant more than his life. He took a streetcar north toward Beale, past the neon hum of nightclubs and storefront churches, each glowing like two different kinds of gospel. The preacher's directions led him to an old brick building above a print shop, where the sign read, "The Defender's Voice" in fading gold letters. Inside, the air buzzed with the sound of typewriters and the smell of ink, that holy scent of rebellion pressed onto paper. Behind a cluttered desk sat L.C. Darnell, a man built like a question mark, shoulders heavy, eyes sharp. He didn't shake Calvin's hand. He studied him first, like a man measuring risk. "You read?" Calvin nodded. "Then I hear you brought hell in an envelope." He laid out the photographs one by one on the desk. Darnell's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. "I knew it," he muttered. "Knew that bastard Crawley wasn't working alone." Calvin told him everything. The river, the sheriff, the ledger, the fire. When he finished, silence filled the room, heavy as judgment. Darnell leaned back, tapping the pictures with the end of his pen. "You understand what this means? They'll burn half the Delta to keep this quiet. You'll never go home again." Calvin looked down at his hands, bruised, cracked, still trembling. "Home's wherever the truth can breathe," he said. For the first time, Darnell smiled, small, weary, but real. "Then we'll give it lungs," he called to the print floor below. "Clear the presses. We're running an extra edition." Within minutes, the room filled with noise, the clatter of machines waking like a giant that had waited too long to move. But even machines have enemies. Through the window, Calvin saw the headlights first, slow, deliberate, pulling to the curb across the street. Men stepped out, their silhouettes too familiar to mistake. "They found us," he whispered. Darnell didn't flinch. "Then they're right on schedule." He pulled open a drawer and handed Calvin a stack of newspapers hot off the press. The front page burned with black letters, exposed, county officials tied to Klan murders. "Get these to the train yard," Darnell said. "My men will handle distribution. You just make sure this story lives." Calvin nodded, heart hammering as the first shot shattered the window. The room erupted in chaos, glass, ink, shouts, and the smell of gunpowder blending into a hymn of defiance. Calvin grabbed the stack, dove for the stairs, and ran through the print shop door into the smoke and sirens of Beale Street, the story alive in his hands, and death only a block behind. The night was red with fire and rain. Sirens wailed somewhere behind him, echoing off the wet cobblestones like judgment. Calvin ran through Beale Street clutching, the newspapers against his chest as the storm came down hard enough to blur the neon. The world was all sound, thunder, shouts, the ripping roar of engines closing in. He turned down a narrow alley where the light bled thinly through broken glass. Ahead, the rail yard loomed like salvation, black silhouettes of freight cars sleeping under a silver sky. He could hear the whistle, distant but real, the last northbound train for Chicago. His legs screamed, lungs burning, but he didn't. Stop! Behind him, footsteps multiplied, boots pounding closer. He could smell gun oil, hear the metallic click of men loading death. He reached the gate and slammed it shut behind him, the chain clanging like a church bell rung by the desperate. For a heartbeat, the world froze between the living and the damned. He stumbled toward the platform, waving the stack of papers at the conductor, already shouting for last call. "This needs to go north," he gasped. The man looked at the headline, once and understood. Fear flickering, then fading into resolve. "Toss it in." Calvin threw the bundle onto the open freight car just as the first bullet tore through the rain, sparking against the rail. He dove behind a crate, heart beating like a drumline for freedom. The gunfire echoed, wild and uncertain, but the train began to move. Slow at first, then faster, its steel wheels shrieking as they caught the track. Calvin crawled forward, dragging himself through the mud, shouting, "Horse into the storm! Go, don't stop!" The conductor's lamp vanished into the darkness, swallowed by speed and distance. The truth was gone now, gone north, gone safe, gone beyond their reach. He stood in the rain, alone, hands shaking, laughter breaking from his throat like something half alive. The cars roared past him, each one carrying another heartbeat of what he had fought for. Then came the pain, sharp, sudden, final. A bullet found his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. The world tilted, the sky bending low. He pressed a hand to the wound, watching his blood mix with the ink that had spilled from the wet newspapers scattered across the platform. He smiled faintly. "Ink and blood," he whispered. "Same thing now." In the distance, the train's whistle cut through the storm, long, defiant, alive. As darkness folded around him, Calvin Reed closed his eyes, knowing that by morning, America would read what he had seen, and that the truth, like the man who carried it, would never bow again.